Today, as we celebrate International Indigenous Day, it's an opportunity for us to reflect upon many indigenous peoples around the world who have suffered very much throughout history in different parts. The Aboriginals in Australia were hunted down like kangaroos from helicopters and killed. Millions of indigenous West Africans were hauled away in chains of slavery across the Atlantic. Millions of indigenous in Latin America died violent deaths during the conquest. In the United States, blankets infected with smallpox were given to Native Americans to speed up the genocide against them. One of the places that we visit in South Dakota when we go there as part of the class amongst the Lakota is Wounded Knee. Wounded Knee is the site of the last massacre in the United States in 1890. 300 men, women, and children were thrown into a mass grave. When we go there to South Dakota, we go and to show our respects at that place of massacre in that time. This has occurred around the world. I just mentioned a few of them. I know there's many other things that have happened around the world. This has happened in the past. However, unfortunately, the prejudice and violence and injustice towards indigenous peoples continues. It continues. Francis Whitelands, some of you met him when you went to South Dakota. He's a Lakota medicine man. He's also an Anglican priest. And I've known him for over 25 years, back in the early 90s. And he's one of the people that we go to learn from when we go there. And he talks about the evils of racism. And he says, well, the state police, they know our license plates when we go to Rapid City. And they'll treat us accordingly, pulling them over, and what happens in that way to a state police towards the indigenous. So racism and prejudice against indigenous peoples, unfortunately, continues. Now, while today we celebrate or remember International Indigenous Day, the church offers us St. Vincent de Paul. And to me, this is an excellent example from our tradition of someone who really reached out to those who are on the poor. Now, his life started out, he was working amongst the rich. He actually served as a tutor and a chaplain to one of the wealthiest families in Paris. So he was a chaplain and a tutor for a very, very wealthy family in Paris at that time. But then he had an experience, which happens to many saints. He had a transformation in his life when he encountered a special encounter. Pope Francis talks about the encounter that he had with a poor peasant. His life turned around. And he turned around to look at the poor who were there and to reach out to them. He had overcome his own prejudice, the prejudice he had had against those who were poor, blaming them for being lazy or whatever. Vincent de Paul founded the Vincentian community, the men's community, and they, of course, had hospitals, orphanages, homes for the mentally sick. And personally himself, he went to prisons, and he also visited those who were enslaved persons in galleys. This is the time of slavery, 17th century. And he would go there and visit them. Also, what was done at that time, you maybe know this, that some people of the church raised money to ransom enslaved peoples. And he did that, for example. Because they couldn't end the slavery, so what they did is they bought the freedom of those who were enslaved. And he did that in North Africa. Later on, together with Luis de Marillac, he founded the Daughters of Charity, a well-known women's community. And he founded them, 17th century, to work outside the cloistered walls. So this is a bit of a revolutionary move in terms of religious life, to move more intentionally away from the cloisters, the convents, especially for the women who were sort of bound at that time by the social understandings. But they reached out, They went beyond that in that way. And something that Vincent de Paul wrote about the Daughters of Charity I found very striking. He said, Their convent is the sick room. Their chapel, the parish church. And their cloister, the streets of the city. Their convent is the sick room. Their chapel, the parish church. Their cloister, the streets of the city. They need to move out and engage what was happening, the poor in the city. In some ways, it reminds me of Pope Francis's use of the field hospital. In that way, the image that he used in that way. Now, what's important, I think, what struck me, at least as I was reading through his life, is that his love for the poor was not sentimental adoration for the poor. And he wasn't about handing out charity. But you know, you can look at the poor and say, oh, look at the poor, they're, you know, see the face of Christ. But I think we have to be very careful that we don't fall into a very shallow sentimentality about this. Huh? And what he said was it must, quote, lead to a practice of effective love. Love at the depth. Huh? So love where we really see the other, whoever that other is, indigenous, poor, someone of a different nationality, color, skin, whatever it might be, we see them as our sister or brother. And that, of course, requires a real transformation or conversion from our prejudice, our racism, our ethnocentrism, just as it did for Vincent de Paul. That's what it means. Vincent de Paul also wrote about the following to his priest and to the sisters community. The poor are your masters, and you are their servants. We are to encounter Christ in the poor and the marginalized. Now, we often hear these words, but in this day for indigenous people, we, including me, all of us are challenged to move beyond sweet sentimentality to see all the marginalized as sisters and brothers and treat them accordingly. We can have all the knowledge about anthropology and that, and of course you know I love social sciences. That's important. But you can have all that knowledge, but if we don't change our hearts, you know what happens? Huh? How we treat people. Huh? And what struck me, what Vincent de Paul said, the poor are your masters. In a way, it reminded me of the South Dakota experience. I know a few of you have gone, some will be going again in the May term. That when we go there, the Lakota people are our teachers. We go to learn, we go to listen, hear their stories. As they tell their stories, not as somebody else would tell them. To really to listen to them. Now, as I'm talking about this, there are movements around the world to restore the dignity of indigenous peoples. And to treat indigenous peoples with human dignity. We move around the world a little bit. In Australia, they have an annual reconciliation day. Established, I don't know, 15 years ago or something like that. And they have this day. So one day, the school children, they learn about it. They learn about what happened to the Aboriginals being hunted down like kangaroos, about the mistreatment that they had. They have a national reconciliation day that way. There also been some handing back of some land to the peoples as well. In Canada has done a lot in terms of the Truth and Reconciliation. They had a process from 2008 to 2015. Truth and Reconciliation Commission, truth-telling, what happened to what they call the First Nation peoples. That's what they call the indigenous peoples in Canada. And so they're beginning to look at restoring justice and dignity to the First Nation peoples in Canada. I know when I was up there last year, the OMI missionaries, who did a lot of work with the First Nation peoples, they were reflecting upon it as part of what is their mission today. Because they have to look at what they did wrong in the past and try to see how can they be a part of reconciliation. In Latin America, the indigenous of Latin America have really drawn together in a very particular way. In the last 20 years, 25 years, they developed it both in terms of their own indigenous theology. They call it Theologia India, indigenous theology, was they developed. And it's not just in paper, it's also in action. Huh? Francis Whitelance, my friend, my colleague, who I've known for some time, he sees the efforts that happens between CTU and Lakota as an effort towards overcoming racism. And he says, I want to prepare people who are going to be missionaries, I want to prepare them in a better way than some of what they experience. Now, they have some great missionaries out there too. I don't want to put all missionaries in They had some missionaries that who were very close to them, but they experienced both sides, the grace and the sin, on both sides. But again, these are the efforts that we make in that way. So on this International Indigenous Day and the Feast of St. Vincent de Paul, I pray for us. First, and we acknowledge the past through truth-telling and correct histories. What's the real histories? Secondly, that we acknowledge the present racism and prejudice within ourselves, within the SVDs, the church, and the world, against anybody that's marginalized or other. Thirdly, to open ourselves up to the grace needed for ongoing conversion from shallow sentimentality towards the poor and the marginalized to what Vincent de Paul calls effective love at the very depth. Now, there's many gifts that Indigenous peoples offer to us and messages that the world needs today in very strong ways, if we can listen and learn. Finally, I'd also like to pray for our new Superior General and his council. They'll begin on Sunday. Our new General Council will begin. And I pray for them that they may faithfully lead our SVDs to more fully participate in God's mission of love, compassion, justice, and reconciliation.